This message was recorded at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove in Asheville, North Carolina. Through the ministry of the Cove, we're training people in God's Word to win others to Christ. It's our goal to develop Christians who experience God through knowing Him better, knowing His Word, building godly relationships, and helping others know Him. We trust that this message will strengthen your walk with God and help you experience Him right where you are.
How are you folks? You're spread out, that's how you are. They came in last night and was told we're going to have you down this half. And I said, all right, we'll be eliminating the back row Baptists. I'm Southern Baptist, so that's not a put down. Well, I get to look at the time here. We get an hour. That's unbelievable. Super. We're, due to my problem, I didn't get the computer here, so we're not going to have a PowerPoint till the second session today. Second session today, not going till tomorrow. But let me say a few things about this course and where I'm coming from and what I hope to achieve and how I came to this subject. Very briefly, I was raised in a Christian home, a German Baptist church, and there's 6 children in the family, 5 boys and a girl. 4 of the 5 boys are either Christian, they're either professors or they're pastors. And my daughter married a guy with a PhD in Old Testament. So we've got came from good family background, good parents, and but I went through a period of doubt for almost 20 years, all of 10 years, and off and on for another 10. And this isn't, some people say, well, I was an atheist before I came to the Lord. And they'll say, well, how old were you? 15. Well, I mean, that as a case I have in mind there, so I'm not just making this up. And you think, well, what did you know at 15? All I'm saying is that I was an adult. In fact, most of my doubt came after I finished my PhD. I was 25 when that happened, so a lot of the time afterwards, I had a lot of studies, a lot of concerns, but I realized very early on my study that if I could know Christianity was true, that'd be a lot easier for me to answer my questions. But our pastor, he was a very strong German pastor, but he didn't think a whole lot of apologetics. He wasn't against them, but he didn't think a lot of them. He actually told me a couple times if he were me, he would recommend that I not study it and go to something else because it might cause doubts. Well, I was hoping it would end my doubts. And so my friends, when they heard I was doubting, they came up and they're saying, why don't you check this out? Why don't you check that out? And the things they were saying were things like, hey, have you heard about the evidence for creation? Or have you heard about fulfilled prophecy and things that are happening in the news right now? Or what about archaeology? Or how about indications that the New Testament is reliable? And I would listen, I would say, yeah, I don't like that one, nah, that makes sense. This one's pretty good, but I have to study it more. And nothing was hitting the mark. And one day I was reading a book, and the author said, if Jesus has been raised from the dead, Christianity follows. I thought, well, that makes sense. People get raised from the dead every day. And if Jesus is raised from the dead, he wouldn't be a liar, wouldn't be a false prophet. His own predictions of the resurrection came true, so it's not Deuteronomy 18. He's not the kind of false prophet as in Deuteronomy 13, where they do miracles and didn't tell you to go some other way. So, yeah, it makes sense. If he was raised from the dead, his teachings are probably true. I think it's a pretty good argument, but I don't know if the resurrection happened. So for me, the first important stage in answering my doubt was whether Christ was raised from the dead. And I could come up with, my mind was too active in those days, but I could come up with a bunch of objections. And I started working through every one of them. And I finished my PhD when I was 25 at Michigan State. And the last year of the dissertation, I was using note cards that I took during my doubts because I had assembled 1,600 note cards during all my studies. I was just very fervent of this. Now this makes me sound like a nerd or something, right? I spent all my time, I skipped all my work in high school. I didn't do what I was supposed to do. That was okay because I graduated, it was okay. Kind of C+ kind of guy. That's not bad for not doing your work. But I played hockey or football all my life. I'm from Detroit. I played hockey or football, so sports where the streetlights were on, before the streetlights came on, and after that, when I went in, my first question was, where did I leave off on my doubts last night? And it was a rough haul. The Lord, and I even had my pastor ask me one time. He saw my mom said, go get the books you're reading. I was like 18 by this time. I was old enough to know the difference. But he saw some of my books and he said, why don't you just study scripture or something? I'd say, well, if I don't know it's true, what can I do? And so he relented the advice to walk away from it, and I kept studying. And I had a lot of dark days, but the Lord got me through it. And I ended up doing my dissertation at Michigan State on the resurrection. And usually today you have 3-person committees for your PhD. I had 6 people on my committee, and 3 of them thought the resurrection happened, and 3 of them said no way. I had 2 agnostics on my committee. I had a Jewish historian on my committee. And I had to satisfy the history, the philosophy, and the religion departments at Michigan State. I had to satisfy all 3 departments. That's the way I arranged it. So I started working and using these cards, and the Lord brought it together. There's just a ton of evidence for the resurrection. And I can honestly tell you that since probably 1990, 88, somewhere in there, the Lord, by his grace, the doubts are way behind me. I haven't gone through anything, haven't had any more since 88 or 90. So what is that, 30 years at least, over 30 years. And now, when people heard my testimony, I had scores of people coming up saying, I'm going through all kinds of stuff, can you help me? And so there's a real practical side of what we're doing this week, and that is handling doubts. And I've probably had 2,000 or 3,000 conversations with doubters. And now I've got 2 former students. One is a pastor, well, they're both pastors. One of them just finished his PhD, and the other one has a master's degree. And they're both taking doubters for a good hunk of their ministry. The one just started a couple years ago, and he's already had 3,000 conversations with people. What I'm telling you is this is a real hurting society, and a lot of Christians are falling away today. I don't know what the definition of it is. I don't know if they were before they did. I don't know if they still are, but they haven't totally left. Got an email from a woman not too long ago, and she said, please help me. I'm hanging on by my fingernails, and if I don't learn the answers to this, I probably will not be a Christian in another week. Now, those sound really serious, but the kind of doubt I had to go back and study psychology, and I don't like psychology, but I had to go back and study just to talk to some of these people. And I bet you if I called her a year later, I think she'd say, I'm barely hanging on by my fingernails, and I'll be gone in a week, because she really loved the Lord. And but I referred her to one of my guys, and they dealt with her, and she did well, because it's not hard to solve doubt. Most doubt, here's lesson number 1 for you on doubt. Most doubt is not solved by facts. So if you listen to this course and you go, I've learned 50 different arguments for the resurrection. I go, that's wonderful. But if you're a doubter who's controlled by their emotions, if you're an emotional person, and your doubt is emotional in nature, you can learn 1,000 facts, and you're not going to get over your doubt. I'll tell you what happens after thousands of talks. If someone comes into your office and they sit down and talk to you, and I just got 3 questions. Okay, let's go for it. And we answer them. And the person stands up and goes, man, I feel great. I'm on top of the world. Thank you for something. Man, I wish I came to you 5 years ago. Yeah. And let's say it's a Monday night. They leave. They're 100% convinced and doing well. Next day, Tuesday, they're 80%, but they're still 80% up the mountain. The next day, they're 60%. Next day, they're 40%. And in a week, they're back in your office. I got some more questions. You just asked me those questions last week. Yeah, I did, but I think I need some boosters here. And you'll learn real quickly when you do this, they're not going to get over their doubt this way. If it's emotional doubt. If it's factual doubt, sure, there's great facts. But if it's emotional doubt, which is by far the most common kind and by far the most painful kind, you have to use another method. Now, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about the other method during the course, but I'll be glad to talk with you privately, or maybe some of you want to ask about it during the Q&A. But that's my background. I was dealing with my own doubts. And then when I got over my doubts, about, like I said, 1990, my wife of 23 years and mother of my children died of stomach cancer. She was only 43. And I thought, wonderful. Probably on top of a funeral, my doubts will probably come back. And they never did. They never came back, thank the Lord. Never came back. And to me, doubting today is just, give me your best shot. It's not going to move me. I mean, there's nothing to it. If you know your way through things. It's sort of like if you got the flu and you're taking the wrong medicine, and for flu it might be, vitamins and not antibiotics. But if you're taking wrong medicine for a sickness, you're not going to get better. I'm taking medicine, yeah, but you're taking the wrong medicine. It's sort of like that, dealing with doubt. So that's kind of my testimony in the beginning. Now my wife is over here, and we've been married for 26 years, and she's pretty good. She's great. It's been a great marriage, and the Lord's provided. And our family, the family is very, very close. And I said this in church Sunday at a meeting. She said, don't say it anymore, because she doesn't want people to celebrate her, but she deserves it. 2 of my children have named their children after her. So we know there's, my family loves her to death. And I'm just thankful to the Lord. But that's a little bit about my trek, a little bit about doubt. I'll be glad to talk about some of these things during the Q&A, the actual doubt things, if you're interested, during the Q&A. One more thing about this course. I have specialized in the resurrection, since my dissertation days and a little before that, going back to my master's. So it's been my life's work in this subject. I'm finishing, it's done, but I have to edit. I'm finishing a 5,500-page, 4-volume commentary on the resurrection that's already under contract to Brauman and Holman, Southern Baptist. Brauman and Holman Academic Publishers. First volume is due out in January of 24, and it's 1,300 pages of evidence for the resurrection. So whatever I say to you today, we're cutting a lot of corners. I teach this course for a PhD course. There's a lot of things. Now, I've given a lot of thought to how I can parse these lectures. And sometimes, if you're not familiar with this material, I'm not trying to go heavy or PhD or anything, but to give the best evidence, I have to explain some things, and those things can be a little bit heavy. So if I lose you anywhere and you think, I didn't get the last 15 minutes, either, ask during the Q&A, or, we can do a dinner time or whatever, but don't worry about what you don't get. That's very, very important. Don't worry about what you don't get. For those of you who get it, it'll be worth presenting it here, because knowing why we're doing these evidences, in other words, we're talking a lot about what history is before we tell you what history there is for the resurrection. So you understand the evidences. And if you know the evidence and how to use it, It's a knockout. If you're using it with critics, they might say to you, it's a bunch of baloney and miracles don't happen, but they will not be able to disprove your case. The world is changing right now, and a lot of critics are recognizing all of this data. And the way I do an argument for the resurrection, you'll hear a lot about this starting tomorrow. We'll get into the evidence itself, starting the very first lecture. And it's one of the little ones that's a little bit of a labyrinth, but it's not difficult. It's not difficult stuff. It's just like a lot of things you may not have heard, but they're pretty simple things. I use 6 facts, which I call the minimal facts. Virtually every scholar in the world, admits them. And I say scholar. The people who deny that Jesus lived are almost never have scholarly credentials. We teasingly say things like, oh yeah, they're still living with their parents in their basement, and they haven't studied this stuff, but they did study Wikipedia. I'm being facetious, but the people who say Jesus never lived are sometimes very active on the internet. When Christians write new books, they'll send all kinds of negative, 1 star out of 5, no stars, and they don't want people to think these are good books. They're very active, and often they're very angry. They'll even refer to their group as angry. But they're not the ones I'm talking about. We can talk about that. In fact, the second lecture today, I'm going to start with, if we're going to talk about Jesus and the resurrection, we should know who he is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we know about Jesus from ancient history. And you'll get a picture of Jesus. I assume most of you have a pretty good idea from the Gospels. Let's see what ancient history says. Because some of these people who are not scholars think we don't have any data for Jesus, and we have a lot. There are, one of the things I published years ago has about 17 ancient sources for Jesus that fit the criteria for historicity. And these things tell us about 60 items about the life of Jesus. And believe it or not, the most common fact is one of the main ones we're doing this week, and that's the crucifixion. How do you know Jesus died? And a few of them report the resurrection, and they're not Christian writings. One of them reports Jesus' appearance to his brother James, which the New Testament says he appeared to him, but doesn't give any details. One of these sources gives details. Now, it's not a great source, but what he says about that meeting between Jesus and his brother is really something. It's really special. It's very, very short, the passage. So we'll have some sources for Jesus, so at least you can be secure about the history of Jesus. And then we'll go straight into, Lord willing, straight into resurrection tomorrow morning, straight into the data. And if you studied the resurrection, the first thing tomorrow is going to be a species of evidence, which I said there's twists and turns, but they seriously are not difficult twists and turns. I lecture on it all the time in churches, and you'll see that there's a whole category of data. Maybe the strongest evidence for Jesus is in this material that I'm doing in the morning. And critics, scholars, when I say critics, I mean scholars, people with terminal degrees. They may be atheist New Testament scholars. They may be agnostic. They may be Jewish historian New Testament scholars. There's a lot of atheist, agnostic, and Jewish scholars who are not Christians, but they're experts in Old Testament. They've got PhDs in New Testament. And they will grant these facts. So the thing we'll be working to it. At the end of the week, I'll give you a lecture on a bunch of other facts about the New Testament, so you'll know the New Testament's also reliable. But for what I'm doing mostly, I'm using just 6 facts plus the empty tomb. I call it 6 plus 1. And there's so much evidence for these 6 facts that virtually, I don't know a credentialed scholar, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, whatever. I don't know one who won't concede all 6 facts. Now here's their problem. If you're going to concede the facts, how do you deny the resurrection? But they're going to concede the basis we're going to use. So it's going to be an exciting trip. One more thing before I give the first message here is that one part I want you to hear. If you don't don't worry about getting behind or not hearing something or 15 minutes getting into it and you move on. It won't keep you from moving forward. Because when we get to the 6 facts, everybody will be on board. And we start that just a few lectures in. And you see why the scholars admit all this. In fact, I'll tell this, if this whets your appetite, the 6 facts plus the empty tomb, I call it 6 plus 1. There's a reason why the empty tomb's not one of the 6. It should be, but there's a reason why it's not. The evidential portions of data that we have. If you think to yourself, think of a number in your head. How many points of evidence do you think there are for these 6.1 facts? You go, I don't even know what the facts are, but they're very well known from the New Testament. In fact, I'll tell you what they are. Jesus died by crucifixion. After his crucifixion, the disciples had experiences which they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. Everybody grants that. Their lives were turned around totally 180 degrees. Fourthly, they began proclaiming it immediately. You might think the best evidence for Jesus is the Gospel of Mark at plus 35 years. What if I told you that dozens of verses we'll start with tomorrow, Lord willing, are often dated between 30 and 35 AD, and nobody knows about them? They're just knockout evidences, and they're very, very early. Now, if you're going to do history, I'll be doing this lecture this hour. What's better than early eyewitness evidence? If you have early eyewitness evidence, you are well on the path toward evidencing your theory. And so I just want to tell you how excited it is. Now think in your mind, this is where I was going, think in your mind, how many things do you think there might be for these? Okay, the fourth one was they preached it very, very early, and then 2 skeptics became believers because they thought they saw the risen Jesus, and that's the brother of Jesus, James, and Paul the apostle. And lastly, the empty tomb. That's 6 plus 1, that's 7 total. How many little pieces of data do you think you could find that you could line up under each one? If you did an outline, how many points would you have from just 7 facts? Now, you ready? There's about 140 evidences for those 6 facts, so 6 plus 1, 7 facts. 140. And they're all early. None of them are later than the Gospel of John, which is still 1st century. And excellent in terms of time at plus 65. So that's where we're going. I'm kind of giving you an overview of the whole course. And my chief interest here, sure, I hope you get the evidence down and you're armed with it. So if you know people who have factual questions, you'll have the best evidence there is. But my main goal in this course is ministry. My main goal is to equip Christians. You could say that probably the 2 most important reasons we do apologetics. Why do we do evidences? Probably the 2 most important reasons. Evidences are worth their weight in gold if all they do is strengthen Christians. If they never lead a single person to Christ. And that's the job of the Holy Spirit, right? But if nobody ever comes to Christ from studying evidences, but Christians are strengthened, that's plenty of reason to be studying evidences. But the second reason is many, many people are coming to Christ today. We have a lot leaving. They're often called the nuns, not N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S. They put that in surveys when it asks, what's your religion? None. And you say, well, I thought you were Baptist. I thought you were Presbyterian. I thought you were whatever. Well, I was, but I'm not now. That's nuns. The other word is the people who fall away now. The big word is deconstructing. They walk away from the faith. And it usually has something to do with falling into sin. And once you fall into sin, it is so easy to start making excuses why you don't believe anymore. You may not be able to explain the facts away, but you're mad at God, or something's happened. Someone's done something to you. You go to a certain church and the pastor had problems and had to leave the church, and that burns the people, and that's wrong with Christians. And Christians don't have it right. How can I believe it? You know what I call that kind of objection, by the way, like pastors and Christians who fall away? I call it the Christians can be jerks objection. And we know Christians can be jerks because we're all sinners. And we know people, and many of the people who fall away like that come back. But people are hurt when that happens. And so the first thing, I'd like to see Christians strengthened. Secondly, many people, as we have the nuns and the deconstructors, we also have people coming. I get emails regularly from people who say, I was an atheist. I didn't know where I was going. I was angry, blah, 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 blah. I studied those 6 facts. I can't get out of the argument. I want you to know that 1 year ago today, I gave my life to the Lord. I've stood the test of time. Didn't happen last week. I've been in a Christian church from following the Lord. Just thought you'd want to know that. Over and over and over. So, if it strengthens believers, and if by it others can come to the Lord, it's worth its weight in gold. Evidences. That's why I'm doing this. So, don't worry. This is an aside, nothing to do with the resurrection. But I have a serious hearing problem. I'm deaf in my right ear. I've lost 50% of my hearing in my left ear. I can't hear a dial tone in a telephone in this ear. So, if you have questions, we're pretty close here. But Don's back there, and I was playing around with it before the service, and he was trying out my equipment. And I said, now look, if anybody asks a question, I'm probably going to have to have somebody repeat the questions. And Ron's here too and going to help out. But don't, if I just act like I didn't hear a single word, if you have to come right up here and say it to me, I'll get it. But I want you to know I'm not, that's not against you. Sometimes my graduate students, I only teach PhD courses, but my graduate students, there are only 12 in the class, and I hear somebody asking a question, it sounds like it's coming from over here. I turn, and I hear this voice go, over here. Oh, he's over here. That happens a lot. So however that might work out, don't be surprised. Okay. Brian, am I allowed to, is it okay to take any questions right now, or do we have to relate it to those 15 minutes? All right. Let's wait. Wait. Good. I got that word. He was shaking his head and his lips were moving, but I didn't hear anything. Okay, no, not a problem. Okay, will you save those up? And I'll be glad to go through those. All right, let me start with this. There's no PowerPoint for this first one, but let me tell you what kind of things people look for in the scriptures when they're using passages that critics will let you use. All right. One thing you have to remember right away, I'm not talking about the guys in their parents' basement who don't have degrees and they just go off on everything and everything, often hate everything Christians are doing. They're not the people I'm talking to. Now, this next lecture today, a little bit, because we're talking about how do we know Jesus lived, and the scholars don't ask that. But we're doing that just in case you have, we're doing ministry here, so in case you know people who are saying Jesus never lived, we'll give you some ammo. If he was raised from the dead, we have to know he lived, right? So that's the second one. But true critics, they can be the harshest ones there are. They can be atheistic skeptics. But they know the data. Keep this in mind, there are 7 New Testament books that they will let you use no matter what. All 7 are written by Paul, and you go, wait a minute, didn't Paul write 13? Yep, but they're going to give you 7 of them. And if you're a pastor, or if you are a pastor, if your pastor is preaching a message on Paul's theology or Paul's whatever, these are the 7 books he's going to use, because they're going to give you the best ones. And they let Paul's books, 7 of them, stand. That's really amazing. Now, why do they like Paul? He's the only one that all critics agree to. We know that they were involved in the New Testament. Some people a majority still of New Testament scholars think Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke. But they're only sure of Paul's writings. He's an eyewitness, and he's the critic's darling. Why do they listen to Paul? Well, first of all, you might say he's got a graduate degree in Old Testament, right? Paul had basically a PhD in the Old Testament. He was a scholar. How do you know? He was a Pharisee. And Josephus tells us, by the way, Josephus, the historian, was a Pharisee. And so Josephus knows, and he said that the Pharisees were intense students. They often repeated their message so people got it. And they were very this is why Paul sounds like such a scholar when you read him. And he's very, very careful. Now, they don't think Paul's an errant or anything, but they don't think he makes very many mistakes either. And they don't think he makes any mistakes that nullify what he's saying. These are atheist New Testament scholars. So I'll tell you what 7 books they are. The 7 books are Romans, that they'll accept. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, I'll give them again in a moment, and Philemon. Again, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, the first 4 of Paul's books. Then the other 3 are Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Now, in the process this week, we'll be talking about why Paul is so important. Now, somebody might say to me, well, why don't you want to use the Gospels? Well, I'll use the Gospels. I'll tell you later this week why we should. That's one of our last lectures in here. We can use the Gospels. But the approach I'm using to start with is the lowest common denominator approach. What I'm saying is, if this is all we have, we still have it. And then if you get more in there, there's Matthew, there's Mark, there's Luke, there's John. Paul has 6 other books. And what about the other epistles? If you have it all, you're just going to increase your case by miles. But when I say there's over 100 reasons to believe these 6 + 1 facts, all of them come from Paul, those 6 books, those 7 books. Philemon doesn't contribute a lot to the historical Jesus, but they'll come from the first 6 of Paul's books that they allow, and certain passages from Acts. Critics don't like the book of Acts, but they like like passages in the book of Acts. Well, I'll tell you why. That's the first lecture tomorrow morning. Okay? Empty tomb. It's number 7. You say, well, 100 for just 6 + 1, 7 facts? That's a lot per. Okay, I'll give you an example. Empty tomb, according to critics, there are over 20 reasons to believe in the empty tomb. Over 20. That's the kind of data we have that most people don't know about. If it's on the resurrection, it's a knockout. And we'll be doing naturalistic theories this week where I have to explain. There's a big 5. You know what's strange about these 5? All 5 are in the New Testament. You know what's even stranger? 3 of the 5 were thought up by believers. See, that's why when you do this subject, you got to talk about doubt. Because there were doubters in 3 of those 5. So, I mean, the big ones, disciples stole the body. Somebody other than the disciples stole the body. Jesus didn't die on the cross. They thought they saw hallucinations. And it's all a tale they copied from pagan mythology, Romulus and Remus and everybody else. Those are the big 5. You can start thinking about where do you see those in the New Testament. They're all there. And 3 of the 5 are questions that Christians have. So even Christians can and do ask these questions. All right. So I gave you the 7 books of Paul. What makes something a good fact? And I'll give you a list of criteria here. The list is probably 2 or 3 times as long as I'm going to give it, but I'm going to use the ones that are relevant for this course. Okay? And I've already told you the first 2. The most important, critics call these criteria. Criterion is singular. Criteria is plural. And there are many things that when these things happen, I'll try to use New Testament examples for you. When these things happen, you're on your way to finding a fact. You go, well, I already believed it's a fact. It's in the Gospels. No. A fact that critics will let you use. If that's the kind of person you're talking to, if it's your child and they're thinking about giving up their faith, if it's a niece or nephew, grandchild, it's good to know these things. And the first 2 are early and eyewitness. We want early witnesses and we want eyewitness, early and eyewitness, and you say, well, aren't those the same thing? They're not. And let me give you an example. Many, many years ago, I heard about a fellow who was writing his memoirs of World War II. Now, you figure, okay, so he was in Germany in the 40s, and when did he write his memoirs? 1990, okay? He's an eyewitness, but that's not early. He's an eyewitness who was writing 45 years later. Doesn't mean he's wrong, but if you wanted to check up on this, that might make you want to do a little bit more checkup on a few of these things since it was written 45 years later. 45 years is not bad. Don't take me, 45 is good in history. But it'd be better if it was an eyewitness and he wrote it the year after he got out of the service. That's how think about testimony in court of law. That's how it works. So early and eyewitness are the best two pieces of data, and we have them in the New Testament. Now, when you hear the first one tomorrow morning, the first of our three messages, they are on material in the New Testament that are called creeds. I'm just introducing this one for tomorrow. This is the evidence that almost nobody knows about that's very powerful, and everybody allows it. They're called creeds or traditions. In the New Testament, there are dozens of little snippets of information. They're usually real short, and I'll tell you why they are short. But they're usually short, and they give little lists of facts. But they generally come from the 30s AD, way before the first gospel was written. They're early, and they're eyewitness. They're the best examples. And there are a lot of them. Well, I'll give you a couple examples right off the bat. Paul says himself, 1 Corinthians 15:3, the best passage on the New Testament, in the New Testament on the resurrection, maybe the most researched New Testament passage, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 7. And Paul says in verse 3, I gave you that which I also received. I gave you what was given to me. Now, Paul wasn't there from the beginning. Well, he was there, but he was either capturing or taking Christians captive and sat there and held the cloaks of those who stoned Stephen. You know the story. But he wasn't there at the beginning as a believer. And so he said, I'm giving you things I learned from others. More about that later. But that's what these creeds are. That's 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 11 is another one you're really familiar with. In 15:3, Paul says, I am giving you that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, buried, rose again according to the Scriptures, and appeared. Four things. Died, buried, rose, appeared. And he said, I got this from other people. Well, that's intriguing. We can talk more about that later. Just a few chapters earlier, I think you're all just as familiar with this passage. 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says, same words, I gave unto you that which I also received, and he adds three words, from the Lord. That's interesting. I'm giving to you that which I also received from the Lord, that Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had gave thanks, he broke it, and later he took the cup, and you know the passage. But don't forget those words that we often read through. I'm giving you what I received from the Lord. Those are very important. So that's early an eyewitness, because Paul's an eyewitness, according to critics, and he's repeating this very, very early. This appears in a book, 1 Corinthians, that is usually dated now about 53 AD. So if we put the death of Jesus at 30, now, footnote, I have a lot of footnotes in here. The second most popular year is not 29 or 31. The second most popular year after 30 is 33, because you have to get the astral bodies right, because you've got to get the Passover right. 33 is fairly popular, but 30 is more important. So I'm going to be talking, it's a nice round figure, and it's a majority view. I'm going to talk like 30 is the year Jesus died. Most people think that these creeds go back to the 30s AD. So you subtract 30, and you'll know about how old these creeds are. But they're basically all in the first 10 years. So what are they? Early and eyewitness. All right, let me give you some other tests for material. One is called multiple attestation. Multiple attestation. It's the two heads are better than one theory. Multiple attestation, I think we're supposed to wait for the questions. Or
is this number 3?
I'm sorry? That's number 3.
Early witnesses, eyewitnesses.
Early eyewitnesses, multiple attestation. Okay. Multiple attestations, do you have more than one source for this? Now let me tell you how critics count sources. This is not how they count sources. Well, the feeding the 5,000 is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's a 3 count, right? No, it's a 1 count. What? Even real conservative Christians. You know why it's a 1 count? Anybody want to tell me why is it a 1 count instead of a 3 count? Yes.
Because it's a story told by the disciples.
Well, it does come from the disciples. What about as a source?
They are all one source.
They are, and why are they all? You're right. Why are they all one source?
Because they were all eyewitnesses.
Well, they all come from the Gospel of Mark. Mark's the earliest. Mark tells it. Matthew and Luke use Mark. This is very conservative. I mean, evangelicals you're going to get this in evangelical seminaries, just like liberal seminaries. But if Matthew got it from Mark and Luke got it from Mark, because Mark's earlier, they may have heard it from somebody else, but you can't know that for sure. If they use Mark, then that counts for 1. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke told this. That's called Mark. That's how they count it. You go, wow, that's going to cut down a lot of my numbers. Really, it's not. It's going to increase a lot because there are other sources. For example, Matthew and Luke use a source. Remember how Luke 1:1-4 says, I checked many sources before I wrote this account? I checked many things out. Sources. And he even says sources from the eyewitnesses. Well, Matthew and Luke are using a source that Mark never has. It's not in Mark. If you use one of those sources, for example, you know John the Baptist went through doubts before he died. He went through doubts. He sent 2 disciples to Jesus. You talk about a heavy question. It's a 2-part question. Here's John the Baptist's question to Jesus. Are you the Messiah, or should we look for someone else? Whoa, your first question was tough enough. But that second one, what, dude? Are you thinking about wandering from the faith? Are you the Messiah? Oh, he just wants a yes, no. He's kind of down. You know, he's in prison. He's going to die. Or should we look for someone else? Because there's this guy down the street, and his name's Buddha. Don't get mad. I'm just wondering. That is only in Matthew and Luke, and it's not in Mark. That's another kind of source. Then there are sayings that are only in Matthew. It's called M. Scholars just give it the name of the first gospel, M. And Luke has passages that nobody else has. So there's 4. If it's in Mark, it's Mark. So I'll even tease my grad students, and I'll say, okay, we got a source from Matthew and Mark. How many sources is it? 2? No. Oh, I get what you're doing. 1, Mark. Yeah, so how many sources are these 2? 1, and what source is it? Mark. It's always Mark if Mark's first. Okay, but if it's a source that Matthew and Luke use, the example I just gave you, John the Baptist doubts, that's a source. And the ones that Matthew uses alone and Luke uses alone, there's 4 sources. John always counts as an independent source. So you could have something, the feeding of the 4,000 is the only miracle outside the resurrection that's recorded in all 4 Gospels. Now, unfortunately, if it's recorded in all 4 Gospels, how many sources do I have? How many?
1.
I'm not hearing well. 2. You're right. 2. What are they? Mark and John. That's correct. And this just isn't the way, quote unquote, liberals think. This is what you'll get in a liberal. You'll get a liberal. Yeah, you will get in a liberal school, but you'll get in evangelical seminaries. This is pretty much accepted the way things work and count. So if you get the feeding of the 5,000, Matthew, Mark, it's in Matthew. I know, that's Mark. It's in Mark. Yeah, I know it's Mark. It's in Luke. Yeah, I know it's in Mark. It's in John. Ah, that's 2. That's how they count. You just have to get used to their counting. But multiple attestation says, how many sources do I have? Now, sometimes What if you're talking about the Last Supper? Well, that's interesting. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. How many does that count? One. Is it in John? Is Last Supper in John? It is. Yes. 2. And I just gave you a text from Paul in 1 Corinthians 11. Oh, that's nice. Mark, John, Paul, and the critics love Paul. You got 3. Now, what if you have 5 or 6? That's going to be some of the creeds that we talk about first thing tomorrow morning. So I hope this isn't just like blowing your brain. It's not hard. It's not like hard to understand material. It's just different. It's just a different way to think. So again, communion is a good example. Mark, John, Paul. That's great. 3 sources. Now, what if I get some of these little creedal things I haven't told you about, and that number goes up to 4 or 5? Well, now it's virtually undeniable. As far as I know, no New Testament critic is going to deny the Last Supper. No New Testament critic is going to deny the crucifixion. No New Testament scholar is going to deny that Jesus was actually dead when he came off the cross. You go, how do you know? We'll give you plenty of reasons. In fact, I just co-authored an article with 2 other guys on the cause of Jesus' death, and we published it in a medical journal. It had to be peer-reviewed by medical doctors to be allowed, and it was published in the Baylor University School of Medicine journal. Everyone's going to grant the crucifixion. You go, what about the burial? Well, that's a little different, because there are a couple some critics who believe Jesus was thrown in you probably heard this, buried in the ground like most people were buried, not in the rock tomb. Rock tombs are basically only around Jerusalem area. You say, well, he was crucified in Jerusalem, but a lot of people were buried in the ground in Jerusalem too. And so there's different questions that bear. But what about the resurrection? Critics don't grant the resurrection, or they wouldn't be critics, but they do grant that the disciples, Paul and James, all thought that Jesus was raised and said they saw him. That's granted. That's a lot. That's a lot. I'm curious, how many of you ever heard of the Shroud of Turin? Almost everybody in here. Okay. Lord willing, I save it for the end in case we run out of time. It'll be the first thing to go. I think the last lecture in here, I'll have to look at where I set out my PowerPoint. I co-authored 2 books on the Shroud of Turin, and my co-author was one of the scientists who did this famous investigation in 1978. I've got slides from the scientists. These are scientific slides. And if you've never heard of the Shroud of Turin, or you don't know why anybody would think it, wait till after you see this and think if you'll ever think about the death and resurrection of Jesus again after the shroud. But I don't think the shroud lights a candle to the evidence from these 6 facts. That historical argument is by far the best thing going. So you're going to get a lot of different ways to know the resurrection by the time this is over. Okay, so those are 3: early, eyewitness, and multiple attestation. Or you could just say multiple sources. 2 heads are better than 1. And I give you an example of how they count. You can get 3 on the Last Supper. You can get 3 on the, you get on many things. You get more than these. And again, what's interesting about this, you probably wouldn't think that maybe your pastor learned this kind of stuff in school because he doesn't talk like this in the pulpit, but he learned these things in seminary because it's the way evangelicals talk too. So there'll be a lot of times here where I'll tell you what critics will grant, and they're not like evangelicals, but that's not these times. Here's some other ones. A 4th rule. Enemy attestation. If the enemies say something is true, it probably is. If the enemies allow facts, they're true. Let me give you some examples. You know, today, this will probably totally blow your mind. Almost all critical scholars, no matter how liberal they are, believe Jesus healed people. He really, really healed people. One of them, he's passed away a few years ago, but he was one of the biggest named critics in the world. He gives a couple of reasons why Jesus healed people. And one of them we've already talked about. And that is because there are multiple sources for Jesus' healing. And that's the way we write history today. That's the way we talk about crime. That's the way we talk about the newspaper article on a murder. We look for, and that's the way an investigator will look for several testimonies that agree, right? That's the same principle. And there's many different evidences that Jesus healed. But one of the other ones, this scholar says, is that the critics agreed he did miracles. Enemy attestation. And here's the critics. Someone tell me, what happened when Jesus did healing miracles or even exorcisms? Almost all critics believe both those things happened. Now they'll be different on what they think he exorcised. They may not believe in demons. But they think what the gospel said happened basically happened. But especially healings. What did the critics say in the New Testament? You're just a lousy magician or what? I mean, what do they claim?
Cast out devils by the king of devils.
Pardon?
Cast out devils because he's Beelzebub.
Somebody would have to interpret that for me. I didn't hear anything.
Cast out devils by Beelzebub.
Yes. And you may have said that too, whoever made the comment. They thought he was casting out demons by power of the devil. You go, well, that's not nice to say to somebody. But wait a minute, time out. What are they saying? They're saying that's the best I can come up with? So you're doing it by some power. Bingo. Jesus healed. Now, Jesus has a great comeback to that. You can't break into a strong man's house unless you first bind the strong man. And so if I'm doing this by Satan's power, and my miracles are binding the strong man, how can I be on his side? That's pretty cool. That's Jesus' comeback. But the critics believe, because of this rule I'm giving you, enemy attestation. The critics thought he was really healing. The critics thought he was really casting out demons. That's enemy attestation. That's number 4. Here's another one. Embarrassment. Embarrassment. Here's some embarrassment. The New Testament, the Gospels are full of embarrassing things that make the disciples they look really, really bad. Why would you do that? I hope my wife will tell you that I've not embarrassed her in public. Maybe by telling her 2 of our kids named their kids after her, but I think that's cool. But I don't think she'll say I embarrass her. We shouldn't do that to the ones we love, right? We shouldn't make them the butt end of jokes so that we look better to our friends, right? That's wrong. So normally we don't say things embarrassing about people we love. But it happens over and over again in the Gospels. Why do you say that the brother of Jesus, James, this is reported over and over again in the Gospels. Twice by Mark, once by John. What is that? How many sources? 2. John and Mark both say Jesus' brothers did not believe. Ooh, that's not so nice. In fact, in Mark 3 and again in Mark 6, they thought he was mentally ill. The Greek actually says they thought he was beside himself, something like a schizophrenic or something. And when he came to preach, they tried to get him out of the spotlight, if you remember that in Mark, presumably because they didn't want to be embarrassed. Why do you paint the brothers of Jesus in that light? Because they didn't believe. Right. So can we trust that as a fact? Yep. Because that's not a nice thing to say. In fact, it's a very major, not very nice thing to say. Here's another one. The chief disciple, Peter, what did he do? What's that? What happens when Jesus comes and he denies him 3 times, and later that passage in Luke is so sad? He went out and wept bitterly. Because remember, I got my sword in the garden. I'll kill anybody who kills you. I'll go to death with you. And the girls, they make it sound like they're pretty young girls, come up to him and test him, and he backs down right away. That's embarrassing. You know what it means? He denied his Lord. Right? How about this one? Maybe the greatest theologian and greatest missionary who ever lived, the Apostle Paul. He held the cloaks of the people who stoned Stephen. Now, we're never told Paul killed anybody, but it does say that when their trials came up, he testified against them that sent them to their death. He had no qualms testifying against them. Well, that's not nice. What's it say in 1 Corinthians 15? He says, I'm not even worthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church. That's embarrassing. By the way, it's a double, right? It's enemy attestation because Paul was an enemy when he told what was going on. And it's embarrassing because our best known missionary and theologian was a critic who made sure Christians got killed. He was probably very, very angry. Okay, so that's enemy attestation and embarrassment in that case. So those are several tests. There's a bunch of others that may come up during the course, but those are the majority ones we're gonna talk about. Most of all, by far, early and eyewitness testimony. And when they're both, that's kind of a bingo. When you get early and eyewitness, you get the story of World War I and it was written 5 years later. That's great. And in our society, what if you have photos? Or, Pearl Harbor. What if you have photos? What if you have testimony from other testimony in the book from the people who were there? I've got a book on my shelf at home. I love the title because it's doing the same thing we're doing, but it's secular history. It's called Eyewitness, the Civil War as We Lived It. Well, that's intriguing. As we lived it? Yep, the book was written, I think, 1953. And the interviews they were doing went back to the 30s. And a number of the soldiers who fought in the Civil War were still alive. And they interviewed them. Now, some of them were 7 years old, and they went out with a squirrel rifle and took some shots at a few people, may have shot somebody, and they were only in the war for a year. I remember in 1960, to the centennial of the Civil War, that there were, if I remember correctly, I could be wrong on this, but just give you an example. I think there were 3 soldiers who fought in the Civil War who were still alive, and they were all Southerners. They were all Confederates. But they were alive. Well, guess what happened when the centennial of the Civil War came? Everyone wanted to do magazine articles and newspaper articles with them. Why? Because you want eyewitnesses. Now, they're not early eyewitnesses, again. That's worse than the World War II example. It's 100 years later. Well, actually, 1865 to 1960, it's almost 100 years. And they could be 105 years old. And maybe you're not going to get a real straight story, but still the journalists wanted to interview them. But I love that title, Eyewitness, the Civil War as We Lived It. That's the way we do history. That's the way we do investigation. Now, Brian, this is when I started. I know it's not 5:45, so is our hour up?
You can keep going.
Till 5:45? 9 more minutes? Okay. Thank you. Okay, so those are some of the tests we're going to use. And now some of you might think, I'm not used to thinking about the Gospels like this. Yeah, but you know what? You'll think like this very quickly if it's your son or your daughter who's having the issues and they're having factual questions and you're learning what the best thing you can say to them is. But if you say things like this, well, honey, that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's 3 sources right there. What are you going to say if they say to you, no, I learned this in school. You're citing one source. So you can get off on the wrong foot right away. So how many of you have ever had conversations with the kind of doubter that I've been talking about here and there? You've dealt with people. You kind of try to talk them through it, answer questions. All over. I guess you guys are in here for a reason. There's a lot of you. It's good to know this stuff, but I hope you're seeing that so far, everything I've told you about is conservative. What I mean is you'll learn it in seminaries. You'll learn at Liberty University if you take a course on New Testament, or take a course in the Gospel of John, or anything like that. And when you look at the dates of these books, they're really early. Now, hopefully we'll get a chance to do this in the week, because I'm dealing with 6+1 for most of this course, because that's going to take all our time. But I would like to tell you later that that's not all we know, that the New Testament is reliable. And I've got about a dozen different ways to know the New Testament's reliable. Got a PowerPoint, actually made by my teaching assistant, who also has a PhD. He's been my teaching assistant for so long, he did his PhD in the process. And for you folks who like things like mixed martial arts, you'd be surprised how many of my PhD students, the guys, occasionally a woman, but you'll be surprised how many of my students have black belts in mixed martial arts. I guess the point is, if you beat somebody up on the ring, you should be able to beat somebody up with apologetics. I don't know, but it's popular. My TA is finishing, he's a test away from getting a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. His wife is 2 belts below him, and she wrestles all the time. She submitted a guy recently who outweighed her by 70 pounds. And she made him tap out. Okay, why am I bringing this up? A lot of people use that kind of argumentation, kind of a warfare kind of thing. Apologetics is sort of about this. I didn't even define it. Apologetics has nothing to do with apologizing. It's a New Testament word, and it means giving reasons for something. Giving reasons for something. And Peter says, be ready to give reasons to everybody who asks you. Now, this will probably come up later in the week, but let me do it right now and tell you how close this stuff is. The critics who live in their parents, I'm not trying to be mean, but I need to differentiate the critics from the critics. The ones who don't believe Jesus lived are called mythers. That's their name for themselves, mythers, and they don't have degrees. There's like 2 of them that are really well known who have degrees, but virtually none of them have degrees. And none of the scholars, I don't care if they're Jewish, atheists, agnostics, they have no question with a whole bunch of information about Jesus. But the ones who are the mythers, they're going to say, you don't have any early sources. You got nothing. Because here's my reason. Christians are prejudiced, just like any other people group. If you're German and you're really pro-German, you're prejudiced on behalf of Germans. So when you try to tell me that something else, don't use German sources. That's prejudice. You're just using your own. Okay, so they'll tell you Mark, Luke, Matthew. Here's the order they usually do it in. Mark is first, Matthew is second, Luke is third, John is fourth. The oldest one, John, is 65 years after Jesus. Almost everybody, conservative and liberal, put John about 95 AD. Subtract 30 for the year Jesus was born, and John's 65 years later. They're going to say, nobody gets it right from 65 years later. A lot of people in here, a lot of you know that's not true, right? Watch. How many of you were witness to an event that you will never forget as long as you live? Saying I do. Birth of your children. Birth of your grandchildren. huge promotions or big events in your life that made the rest of your life for you. Something happening politically was just the way you fought for this thing. You know, whatever. You had huge things in your life, and you remember that night you graduated. You got degrees or high school. How many of you remember key events in your life that were 65 or more years ago? How many of you? Look at this. I get a lot of us. My hand's up too. A lot of us, 65 years. Are you sure they occurred? Are you sure you're married? It was 65 years ago? Are you positive you said I do? And are you sure it's that same person sitting next to you? Are you sure? Right, I would die for it. I'm positive. Okay? Why couldn't that be a gospel writer? Mark is dated about 60 AD. A friend of mine just did a survey with critics and unbelievers. Mark is dated about 60 AD or plus 30. Matthew, by critics now, I'm using the critics' dates. Evangelicals go a little earlier on Matthew and Luke. Matthew, according to critics, about 80, which is plus 50. Luke, about 85, which is plus 55. And everybody dates John at about 95 AD or plus 65. And you saw the hands here. We can be very sure of things from 65 years. Nah, I'm not going to let Christians testify on their own behalf. Okay, let's see if somebody else can testify on their own behalf. I'll give you some quick examples in 2 minutes. The earliest sources for Buddha. By the way, I'm not picking bad examples. I'm picking the best. I'll give you a secular one, Alexander the Great, and a religious one, Buddha. The best sources for Buddha date from 600 to 800 years after he died. And you know what's amazing? How many critics will say, John is so stinking late at plus 65. And a guy actually said this in a debate I was involved in. He said, yeah, but if I have to believe in Jesus' miracles, I got to believe in Buddha's miracles. Whoa, time out. We got Jesus' miracles from the 30s. Wait for tomorrow's sources. 30s. Buddhas are 600 to 800 years later. Are you saying they're the same thing? If I have to vote for this, I got to vote for that? Why? Don't you differentiate between 10 years and 600, 800 years? A book I have on my shelf starts out, it's a Buddhist PhD. He starts out like this. Here's how he starts on page 1. Christians have the words of their Lord. We don't. They have the words of those who study under their Lord. Yeah, that's a nix too. Christians have the words of those who studied under their Lord. Yeah, we can't touch that. In fact, he says the sources, and I'm using this book, are 600, it's his years, 600, 800 years later. And he says, I want to tell you guys something. He tells his readers, we don't even know what Buddha taught. Why are you a Buddhist? Man, that's beautiful poetry and beautiful stories. And it's ethics. I like to meditate. I can live like this. How do you know it's true? I don't care if it's true. It's not about facts. I feel good. And Buddhism, nobody asked me to have really strict views, so I'm okay. I'll do it. And I don't want to be a Christian anyway. You guys are brats. You see, that's how it works oftentimes. Alexander the Great. The earliest biography of Alexander the Great is just short of 300 years after he died, 280. After he died. Now, there were eyewitnesses, including a general or two, who wrote biographies of Alexander, but we don't have them. They may find them someday. If you hear they found them, great. But right now, we don't have them. It'd be great if they found them in the monasteries where they copy these things. We don't have them. The best biographies of Alexander are Arrian and Plutarch. They were written 425 to 450 years later. Almost half a millennium. And what do these guys still say to us? Are you kidding me? John is plus 65. Yeah, I know. What's your problem? And what about the sources tomorrow that are in the 30s? It's plainly prejudice. Plainly. So,